My mother lost her job and her marriage in the same morning, and the worst part is, she didn't understand why until 4 months later, standing in a dead man's filing room on a farm she barely remembered inheriting, holding a letter that changed everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My mother's name is Lenora, and if you had met her 20 years ago, you would have described her the same way everyone did. Sharp, methodical, quietly formidable. She had a CPA designation and a mind for numbers that bordered on unsettling. She could look at a company's balance sheet for 20 minutes and tell you exactly where the problems were hiding. It was this skill that first attracted my stepfather, Gareth, or so I came to understand much later, when I was old enough to recognize the difference between a man who loves a woman and a man who sees a use for her. He was 41 when they met. A mid-sized renovation contractor operating out of Mississauga with ambitions that far outpaced his accounting. My mother was 36, I was 10 years old, and I'll admit, I liked him at first. He was good with his hands, told stories well, and he made my mother laugh in a way I hadn't seen in years. They married quickly, and within 18 months, my mother had taken over the financial operations of what was then a modest company called Meridian Build Corp. Over the next 2 decades, she built that company's financial infrastructure from scratch. She renegotiated their banking covenants. She restructured their labor costs. She hired the accounting team and designed their internal audit protocols. When Meridian landed its first significant government infrastructure contract, a $14 million highway restoration project north of Barrie, it was my mother's financial guarantees and her meticulous bid documentation that made the proposal credible enough to win. Gareth had the charm, the contractor's license, and the vision. My mother had the discipline that made the vision survivable. She believed they were building something together. She believed that for 20 years. She was wrong. I remember the call I got on a cold Tuesday morning in late March. I was in my Toronto apartment, getting ready for work, when my phone rang. It was my mother. She never called before 9. "They've terminated my employment," she said. Her voice was completely flat, not the flatness of calm, the flatness of someone whose brain hasn't yet caught up to what just happened. There was a letter on my desk when I arrived. Gareth was already gone from the building. "What do you mean, terminated?" "They're alleging I misappropriated company funds." A pause. The divorce papers were in the same envelope. I need to stop here for a moment, because even now, writing this, the deliberateness of that act makes my chest tighten. The misconduct allegation wasn't random. My mother was a CPA in good standing with CPA Ontario. An unproven allegation of financial misconduct triggered a mandatory professional review. It meant she couldn't work in her field while it was under investigation. It was a surgical move. Neutralize the one person who knew every line of Meridian's books, cut off her ability to earn income, and do it all in a single morning while she was too blindsided to respond. I found out later there had also been someone else, a junior sales coordinator on one of Gareth's Etobicoke condo projects, a woman 10 years younger than me. But that detail was almost secondary to everything else. The affair was the motive. The termination letter was the weapon. Gareth had been planning it for well over a year. By the time that letter landed on my mother's desk, he had already restructured Meridian's internal controls to remove her signing authority, set up a new account management structure, and quietly moved the most significant marital assets into a series of numbered companies registered in Ontario. The family home in Oakville had been placed into a family trust 8 months before the divorce filing. Every material asset had a firewall around it before she ever opened that envelope. Under Ontario's Family Law Act, spouses are entitled to equalize their net family property, meaning both parties pool and divide the growth in their assets accumulated during the marriage. It's a reasonable principle in theory. In practice, when one spouse controls every asset through a labyrinth of numbered companies and his own hand-picked accountants, the equalization calculation can look very different from reality. My mother's lawyer in Mississauga was competent but general. Gareth's team had prepared for years. The mediation was, by my mother's description, less like a negotiation and more like being asked to argue against a wall. She came out of the settlement with enough to cover 14 months of expenses, no ongoing spousal support, because Gareth's team successfully argued the misconduct allegation undermined her claim, and a property deed for a rundown farm near Thornbury she hadn't thought about in 15 years. The farm had belonged to her great-uncle Alban, her mother's older brother, a man she remembered as tall, precise, and deeply private. He had died 4 years earlier, at 81, leaving my mother the farm and everything on it as his sole remaining blood relative. It was 80 acres of mixed bush and old pasture in Grey County, roughly 2 hours north of Toronto, with a main farmhouse that hadn't been properly maintained since the 1990s, and a large timber frame equipment barn that looked like it had been slowly accepting its own irrelevance for decades. The property was assessed at $340,000. My mother had intended to list it after the estate settled, but had never gotten around to it. She had no idea in any meaningful sense that it would become the thing that saved her. The drive up from Mississauga to Thornbury was the loneliest she had ever made. She told me later that she stopped at a Tim Hortons in Barrie and sat in the parking lot for close to an hour before she could make herself continue north. She was 54 years old. She had spent 2 decades building a company that she no longer had any legal claim to. The CPA Ontario review hung over her head like a sentence. She had enough money to last a little over a year, a Honda CR-V with 180,000 kilometers on it, and a dead man's farm in Grey County. The farmhouse smelled of old wood and neglect. The propane furnace needed servicing before it would run reliably. The pipes under the kitchen sink had developed a slow leak that had been quietly warping the cabinet floor for years. The back bedroom ceiling had a dark stain from a roof that had been patched once and never again. My mother told me she stood in the living room on her first night, looking at the peeling wallpaper and the listing shelf above the fireplace, and she thought, "This is all I have. This is every single thing." Then she tied her hair back and got to work. Over the first 10 days, she cleaned, patched what she could with materials from the hardware store in town, and began sorting through her great-uncle's belongings. He had been a man of few personal effects but many papers. The farmhouse had a back room he had clearly used as an office, a small cold space with a single frosted window and a lockable oak door that she had to shoulder slightly to open. The key was on a ring she found in the kitchen utility drawer, labeled in his neat, deliberate printing. Back room, L only. L. Lenora, her name. She called me the same evening she found it, and I could hear the shift in her voice when she described it. He had labeled that key for her. Specifically, exclusively for her. Inside the back room were 4 tall filing cabinets, a heavy wooden desk with a locked center drawer, and shelving that ran floor to ceiling packed with binders, accordion folders, and flat archival boxes. The oldest files dated to 1971. The most recent were from 3 months before great-uncle Alban died. He had not, my mother quickly understood, spent those years thinking about much else. It took her 4 full days to grasp what she was looking at. Her great-uncle had been an investor. Not a passive one, a serious, deliberately concealed investor. Starting in the late 1980s, he had been one of the original capital contributors to a small construction operation in Mississauga. The original company was called Ridgemore Contracting. In the mid-90s, Ridgemore was restructured, renamed, and brought under new operational management. The restructuring documents in her great-uncle's files showed a partnership dissolution agreement. The equity allocation in that document showed Alban retaining a 30% beneficial interest in the successor entity. The successor entity was Meridian Build Corp. My mother sat on the cold linoleum floor of that filing room and read those documents 3 times. Her great-uncle had held a silent 30% stake in her husband's company for over 2 decades. A stake that had never appeared in any disclosure, any financial statement, any regulatory filing, or any conversation, not once, in 20 years of marriage. She didn't call me that night. She called me the next morning, her voice quiet and careful in the way it gets when she's thinking very fast. "I need you to come up this weekend," she said. "I've found something." By the time I arrived on Saturday, she had the desk covered in organized files and had started a timeline on graph paper she'd found in the kitchen drawer. I looked at what she'd assembled and said what any reasonably alert 28-year-old would say in that moment: "This could be worth millions." "I know what it's worth," she said, not looking up from the page. "I need to find out how far it goes." It went much further than either of us expected. The locked center drawer of the desk required a different key. She found it taped to the underside of the top drawer, something she only discovered by pulling the drawer out completely to clean the frame behind it. Inside the center drawer was a fireproof metal document box with a 3-digit combination. The combination was written on the back of her great-uncle's Ontario driver's license renewal card, tucked into his wallet in the bedroom closet, in a shoebox that smelled of cedar and old leather. Inside the box were 3 things. The first was a letter, handwritten on 4 sheets of pale blue paper, addressed to my mother by name. It was dated 14 months before his death. He had written it knowing he was ill, a fact she hadn't known because he had told no one. She found out only from the letter itself. In a single sentence he'd written without self-pity and moved on from immediately. "I didn't tell you about the diagnosis because there wasn't anything useful you could do about it, and I wanted the time I had left to be productive." In the letter, her great-uncle explained everything. He had entered the original investment in Ridgemoor as a silent partner at the request of the company's founder, a man he'd known for years. When Gareth took over the restructured entity, her great-uncle had initially extended him the same trust. Over time, he had begun to have doubts. He had kept watching. And what he had watched, with a farmer's patience and the precision of a man who had kept meticulous records for 50 years, was 2.5 decades of financial manipulation that had grown more elaborate with every passing year. The second item was a USB drive. On it were 1,340 scanned documents, the oldest dated to 2001. The most recent were from 11 months before he died, less than 3 years ago. He had spent years carefully requesting documents from former associates, cross-referencing public filings, and my mother's voice went very quiet when she told me this part. He had retained a retired forensic accountant in Owen Sound to help him organize and interpret what he was finding. The picture that emerged from those documents was systematic. Meridian Build Corp had been maintaining parallel financial records for at least a dozen years. The official records, the ones filed with the Canada Revenue Agency and presented to private investors, showed healthy revenues, manageable leverage, and steady margins. The shadow records, the internal figures Gareth tracked separately, told a completely different story. Construction costs on government contracts had been inflated by between 12% and 19%, with the difference routed through a numbered subcontracting entity that existed only on paper. The ghost company's revenue flowed through a holding structure registered in the Isle of Man. The total estimated amount of unreported income, fraudulently obtained government contract overpayments, and unremitted HST, based on her great-uncle's painstaking calculations, was somewhere north of $4 million. And tucked into the back of the USB documentation, organized in its own clearly labeled folder, was a second tranche of files that made my mother stop breathing for a full minute. Account statements from the same Isle of Man structure, cross-referenced with dates and amounts from the Meridian divorce mediation. The assets Gareth had sworn under oath didn't exist were documented, with routing numbers and account identifiers, in her great-uncle's organized files. He hadn't just hid money from her. He had committed perjury in front of a family court judge. The third item in the box was a statutory declaration, signed by her great-uncle before a notary public in Owen Sound, witnessed by 2 independent parties, dated and sealed. A sworn statement that documented what he had observed and gathered, admissible as evidence. At the bottom, In the space labeled Additional Remarks, he had written 11 words in his precise handwriting. I built this record for Lenora. She will know what to do. My mother did not cry when she read that sentence aloud to me. I did. She spent the following 3 weeks at the farm. I drove up every weekend. She worked 12-hour days cross-referencing the documents against her own 20 years of memory. There were transactions she recognized immediately, invoices she had processed herself, payments she had signed off on, contracts she had reviewed without any reason to question them. Seeing them now against the shadow records was like being handed a key to a lock she hadn't known was there. She called Philippa on a Thursday evening. Philippa had been a classmate at CPA Ontario nearly 25 years earlier. They'd drifted for a decade and reconnected at a professional development event in Ottawa. Philippa now ran a forensic accounting practice in North York. She drove up to the farm the following Saturday with her laptop and a case of files, and she and my mother spent 14 hours at the kitchen table. When Philippa finally looked up, near midnight, she said very simply, "Lenora, this is one of the most complete cases of systematic financial manipulation I've ever seen. This isn't ambiguous. This is criminal." They contacted the CRA Informant Leads program the following Monday, then the RCMP Commercial Crimes Section in Toronto, then the Ontario Securities Commission, because a portion of the fraud involved misrepresented financials used to attract private investors to Meridian's Etobicoke condo project. The CRA Informant Program offers between 5% and 30% of federal tax amount recovered, provided the recovered amount exceeds $100,000. Based on the scope of what was documented, my mother's potential payout was substantial, but she wasn't finished. Through a referral from Philippa, she retained a Bay Street litigation lawyer named Declan, a quiet, sharp man in his late 40s who had spent the first half of his career as a commercial litigator specializing in financial fraud cases. Declan helped her incorporate a numbered company, 2014891 Ontario Inc., registered anonymously through a corporate agent. Using a portion of her settlement money and a personal line of credit secured against the farm, the numbered company approached the private equity lender, holding a $22 million mezzanine loan on Meridian's Etobicoke Tower. They purchased the loan at a modest premium. My mother became Gareth's primary creditor. Declan called the next step pressure calibration. My mother called it what it was, making him panic enough to make mistakes. On a Tuesday in October, exactly 8 months after the termination letter had appeared on her desk, a registered letter arrived at Gareth's personal office in Mississauga. Inside was a single document, a high-resolution scan of one page from her great-uncle's consolidated ledger, showing the Isle of Man holding structure with Gareth's digital signature on the account authorization form. Paperclipped to it was a note typed on plain white paper. The partnership was never dissolved. Check your email. 5 minutes later, his inbox contained an official notice of default from 2144891 Ontario Inc. Due to irregularities in the borrower's financial disclosures, as identified through recent CRA audit activity, the mezzanine loan was being accelerated. He had 60 days to produce $22 million in liquid capital, or the numbered company would appoint a receiver over the Etobicoke development and any associated Meridian assets. Gareth's lawyers spent the better part of the afternoon trying to identify who was behind 2144891 Ontario Inc. Numbered companies in Ontario don't publicly disclose officers or directors without a formal court order. The registered agent was a law firm that declined to provide any information whatsoever. He got nowhere. Meanwhile, Declan received a quiet confirmation from his CRA contact. Gareth had attempted to access his Isle of Man accounts to move funds in response to the default notice. The CRA had placed an administrative freeze on those accounts 9 days earlier. The moment the access attempt registered, it confirmed active knowledge, active control, and an active attempt to use funds concealed from Canadian tax filings to cover a domestic commercial obligation. Declan described this to us the next morning with a particular kind of professional satisfaction. The attempted access had turned a tax evasion case into active fraud under the criminal code. The meeting was set for a Thursday afternoon at 2 o'clock at Declan's satellite office on King Street West. Gareth arrived with 2 lawyers and a junior associate. I am told by Declan, who had security camera access at the building entrance, that he looked like a man who had not slept properly in 3 weeks. The confident developer I had watched charm rooms full of investors for years had been replaced by someone gripping his briefcase with both hands and moving through the lobby without making eye contact with anyone. My mother had arrived 40 minutes early. She was wearing a charcoal blazer she had bought in Owen Sound the week before and a pair of small gold earrings that had belonged to her great-uncle's late wife. She had her hair pulled back. She sat at the far end of the conference table with the fireproof document box in front of her and both hands flat on the polished surface, and she waited. When Gareth walked into the room, he was still mid-sentence to one of his lawyers. Then his eyes tracked across the length of the table, and he stopped speaking. The lawyer kept going for another 2 words before he noticed the silence. Lenora. Gareth said her name the way you say a word you didn't expect to hear. His voice, which was used to commanding rooms, barely reached across the table. The principal of 214891 Ontario Inc. is available to discuss the default, Declan said pleasantly, gesturing toward my mother. The senior partner had already opened the document package they'd been handed at the door. 12 pages, organized by category, referenced against the statutory declaration and the USB drive contents. My mother and Philippa had spent 3 weeks building that package from source documents. It was, to use Declan's word, clean, the kind of clean that takes years of lived expertise to produce. The lawyer read for less than 5 minutes. Then he closed the folder, leaned toward his junior associate, and said something I wasn't in the room to hear. He picked up his briefcase. He stood. "Gareth," he said, and his voice had changed in a way that told you everything you needed to know. "I have a professional obligation that requires me to speak with you privately before this meeting continues." He did not speak with him privately. He and both associates walked directly out of the room. Gareth watched the door close behind them. Declan told me later that the sound of it echoed in a way that felt disproportionate to the size of the room. What my mother described to me once, carefully and only once, was this. Gareth sat down across from her. He looked at the summary document. He said he was sorry. He said the company had nearly collapsed in 2009, and he had made choices under extraordinary pressure that he couldn't undo. He said he still cared about her. He said they could manage this together, quietly, the way they had always managed things. She let him finish. Then she placed her great-uncle's letter on the table, not the statutory declaration, just the letter, the one on 4 sheets of pale blue paper, and she said, "He spent the last 5 years of his life building this for me, because he knew, long before I did, what kind of man you were." She stood and told him to look out the window. On King Street below, 2 RCMP vehicles had pulled up to the building's side entrance. A third was double parked on the street. 4 officers in plain clothes were visible through the lobby glass, badges at their belts, speaking with building security. Gareth said nothing. The conference room door opened behind him. The lead officer confirmed his name and informed him he was being arrested under the Criminal Code of Canada for fraud over $5,000, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit securities fraud. He was asked to stand and place his hands behind his back. My mother did not stay to watch them read him his rights. She picked up the document box, nodded once to Declan, and walked to the elevator. She pressed L for lobby. She rode down 14 floors alone, stepped out onto King Street into a cold October afternoon, and stood on the sidewalk in the wind coming off the lake. Then she called me. "It's done," she said. "Are you okay?" I asked. She thought about it for a moment, which is very like her. "I'm going to get a coffee," she said. "Then I'm going to drive home." She meant the farm in Thornbury. 3 years have passed since that Thursday. Gareth was convicted on 3 counts in Ontario Superior Court and is currently serving a federal sentence. The proceedings recovered $4.1 million in unremitted taxes and fraudulently obtained government contract overpayments. Under the CRA Informant Leads program, my mother received a payment of $615,000. The silent partnership stake, the 30% beneficial interest her great-uncle had quietly, carefully preserved in his files for over 2 decades, was restored to his estate and passed to my mother as his sole heir. Its assessed value, based on what Meridian had been worth before the fraud proceedings unwound the company, came in at just under $1.2 million. The professional misconduct complaint Gareth had filed with CPA Ontario was withdrawn as part of the criminal proceedings when the manufactured nature of the allegation became part of the evidentiary record. My mother's CPA designation was fully reinstated. She did not go back to Mississauga. She spent 8 months and a portion of the settlement restoring the farm. The back room where her great-uncle had kept his files is now her office. She had the roof done properly, 30-year warranty this time. The warped kitchen cabinet floor was replaced. The back pasture, it turned out, had a heritage apple orchard buried under 40 years of overgrowth, and she has been clearing it by hand for 2 summers now, row by row, tree by tree. She also established a small fund in partnership with a women's legal services clinic in Toronto. It covers the cost of forensic financial review for women going through divorce proceedings where they have reason to believe their spouse is concealing assets. She named it after her great-uncle. She doesn't make a production of it. She just pays the quarterly contributions, quietly, without any announcement, the way a man she barely knew kept meticulous records in a locked room for 25 years and labeled a key with a single letter, waiting for the right moment to put everything he'd built into the right pair of hands. When I ask her now whether she's happy, she does what she always does. She considers the question honestly before she answers. "I'm building something that belongs entirely to me," she says. "That's a different thing from happy. It's better." I think her great-uncle would have said the same.